In a small Montana town, former police officer John Miller rescues a scarred and frightened dog he names Buddy. As John helps Buddy heal, he discovers the dog's traumatic past with Carl Dawson, a dangerous criminal running a network of illegal dog fights and smuggling operations. When Carl attempts to reclaim Buddy, John refuses to back down. Together with Rebecca, a determined lawyer, and Officer Brian, they uncover incriminating evidence against Carl. The journey is fraught with danger, from warehouse raids to daring confrontations at an airstrip. Through it all, Buddy proves his bravery, saving John and helping dismantle Carl's operation. The story culminates in Carl's capture, but not before he hints at an even larger network of crime. Despite the looming threat, John and Buddy find hope and purpose by creating Buddy's Haven, a rescue center for abused animals. What do you think about Buddy's incredible journey? Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel DG Story for more inspiring and thrilling tales. Let's embark on more adventures together. This story reminds us of the power of loyalty, courage, and second chances. Buddy's transformation and the bond he shares with John inspire us to stand up for what's right, no matter the odds. What about you? What inspires you most about this tale? The Montana winter had descended on the small town like a blanket of ice. Snow piled high on the sidewalks, crunching underfoot as the occasional passerby hurried home. A chilling wind blew through the narrow streets, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the distant sound of cracking ice on the nearby river. Inside his modest convenience store, John Miller worked quietly, restocking shelves. The heater hummed softly in the corner, and the faint aroma of coffee brewed from a pot behind the counter. Life here was slow and predictable, exactly how John liked it. After retiring from the police force 3 years ago, he had traded the chaos of city life for the solitude of this remote Montana town. He appreciated the silence, even if it sometimes felt heavy. John reached for the broom to sweep the front of the store when he saw a shadow flicker past the frosted glass door. Frowning, he stepped closer to investigate. Through the glass, he caught sight of a dog. Thin, trembling, and filthy, pacing nervously by the trash bins outside. John's breath fogged the glass as he peered closer. The dog paused, lifting its nose toward the bins, then darted forward, its ribs visible under its matted fur. John unlocked the door and stepped out into the biting cold. "Hey there, buddy," he called softly, his voice low and steady. The dog froze mid-motion, turning its head toward him. Its dark eyes were wide with fear, darting around as if expecting a trap. "You hungry?" John asked, crouching down. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of beef jerky he had been saving for later. The dog took a hesitant step forward, then another. It stopped just out of reach, sniffing the air. John stayed still, his hand outstretched. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'm not gonna hurt you." After a long pause, the dog darted forward, snatching the jerky, before retreating to a safe distance. It devoured the food in seconds, its ribs heaving as it gulped it down. John noticed a scar around the dog's neck, a thin, pale line where fur no longer grew. His stomach tightened. Someone had kept this dog chained, and not gently. "You've had it rough, haven't you?" John said softly. He rose to his feet and stepped back toward the store, leaving the door slightly ajar. Minutes later, the dog crept into the store, its movements cautious and deliberate. Its paws left faint prints on the tiled floor as it sniffed the air. John had set a bowl of water and an old blanket near the heater. "Here you go," he said, gesturing to the setup. The dog hesitated, its eyes flicking between John and the blanket. Slowly, it approached, sniffing the blanket before curling up on it. Its body was tense, but the warmth of the heater soon worked its magic. John watched as the dog's breathing slowed, its trembling subsiding. He smiled faintly. "Guess I'll call you Buddy," he said. Buddy's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Over the next few days, Buddy became a regular presence at the store. In the mornings, he would wait outside until John unlocked the door, his tail wagging cautiously. At first, Buddy wouldn't let anyone near him, but slowly, he began to trust John. John found himself talking to Buddy as he worked, sharing stories about his time on the force and the reasons he left. He told Buddy about his old partner, Mike, who had been killed during a routine traffic stop gone wrong. "I couldn't do it anymore after that," John admitted one evening, sitting on the floor beside Buddy. The dog rested its head on his knee, listening quietly. Most took away the consumption as the subject drew closer to worry mode. "You know," John added, scratching behind Buddy's ears, "you've got that same look Mike used to give me, like you're always watching, always ready to jump in if things go south." Buddy's tail thumped softly against the floor. It was late one evening and the store was empty. John had just finished sweeping when the bell above the door jingled. A man stepped inside, his boots crunching on the salt-scattered floor. John looked up and immediately felt a chill. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered leather jacket and an air of menace. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Buddy, who was lying near the counter. John handed Buddy his keys and transferred his friend out of the room. Buddy looked up and immediately felt a chill. Buddy bolted upright, his body tense. A low growl rumbled from his throat. "Well, well," the man drawled, his lips curling into a smirk. "There you are, you little runt." John stepped forward, placing himself between the man and Buddy. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone firm. The man ignored him, taking a step closer to Buddy. "Name's Carl Dawson," he said. "That dog belongs to me." "Dog?" John's eyes narrowed. "He doesn't look like a dog who wants to go back to you." Carl's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "Doesn't matter what he wants. He's mine. Legally." Buddy's growl deepened, his hackles rising. You put that..." "You need to leave," John said, his voice low but steady. Carl stared at him for a moment, then chuckled darkly. "You're making a mistake, old man. That mutt's worth more than you know. I'll be back for him." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. That night, John locked the doors and pulled down the shades, his mind racing. He sat on the floor beside Buddy, who was curled up tightly, his body trembling despite the warmth of the heater. "What have you gotten me into, Buddy?" John whispered. Buddy lifted his head, his eyes meeting John's. There was a mixture of trust and fear in them, a silent plea for protection. John sighed and scratched behind Buddy's ears. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not letting anyone hurt you again. Not ever." The next morning, John woke to find Buddy lying by the front door, his head resting on his paws. The dog's body was still, but his eyes were wide open, scanning the room like a sentry on duty. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" John asked softly, pulling on his boots. Buddy wagged his tail faintly, but his eyes darted toward the window at the sound of a passing car. John sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. The man from the night before, Carl, had left him unsettled. It wasn't just the threat he'd made, it was the way Buddy had reacted. The scars on Buddy's body hinted at a dark past, and Carl had all but confirmed it. After a quick breakfast, John loaded up the store's register and prepared for the day. Buddy followed him, sticking close, his nose twitching as he sniffed every corner of the room. Around noon, the bell above the door jingled, and John looked up to see his friend and lawyer, Rebecca Turner, walking in. She was a tall woman in her late 30s, her auburn hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. "You called me late last night," Rebecca said, dropping her leather bag on the counter. "What's going on?" John motioned toward Buddy, who was sitting by the counter, his eyes fixed on Rebecca. "It's about him," John said. Rebecca crouched down, holding out her hand. Buddy sniffed her cautiously, then nudged her fingers with his nose. "Ha! Sweet dog," she said, scratching behind his ears. She looked up at John. "What's the problem?" John explained what had happened, how Carl had stormed in, claiming Buddy as his own, and how he had left with a promise to return. Rebecca's expression darkened. "Did he show any proof that the dog belongs to him?" "No," John replied, "but he sounded confident, like he knew something I didn't." Rebecca sat back on her heels, her mind working. "If he tries to take legal action, it's going to get messy. Do you have any documentation, papers, a microchip, anything that shows ownership?" John shook his head. "Buddy just showed up here a few days ago. I don't know where he came from." Rebecca frowned. "That's not good. Without proof, the law usually sides with the original owner. If Carl can prove he's the owner..." John felt his chest tighten. "So, what do we do?" Rebecca stood, brushing off her hands. "First, we need to protect Buddy. If Carl's willing to intimidate you, there's no telling what he might do. I'll start digging into his background. Maybe we can find something to discredit him." "Thanks, Rebecca," John said. Rebecca gave Buddy one last scratch behind the ears before leaving. As the door closed behind her, John knelt beside Buddy. "Looks like we're in for a fight," he murmured. Buddy pressed his nose against John's hand, his tail wagging softly. The following days passed in a haze of unease. Buddy rarely left John's side, shadowing him through the store as if sensing the tension in the air. Every creak of the floorboards or jingle of the doorbell made both of them flinch. Their nerves stretched taut. Rebecca called a few days later with updates. "I've done some digging on Carl Dawson," she began, her voice sharp. "Turns out he's got a record, a long one. Animal cruelty, illegal trading, even a few charges for assault. The charges never stuck, though. Either the witnesses disappeared or the evidence vanished." John gripped the phone tighter, his jaw clenched. "So, he's been doing this for a while." Rebecca sighed. "He's not just some thug, John. He's part of something bigger. I wouldn't be surprised if Buddy is more than just a pet to him. He might have been training the dog for something. Fights, smuggling, who knows?" John glanced at Buddy, who was lying at his feet, chewing on a rubber ball. The thought of someone using him for violence made John's stomach turn. "So what's the next step?" he asked. "I've filed a preliminary report with the local authorities," Rebecca said. "It's a long shot, but it puts Carl on their radar. In the meantime, you need to document everything, photos of Buddy, his condition, any interactions with Carl. If this goes to court, you'll need as much evidence as you can get." John nodded even though she couldn't see him. "Got it. Thanks, Rebecca." That evening, John took Rebecca's advice to heart. He snapped photos of Buddy, capturing the scars that crisscrossed his body. He even managed to get a shot of the faint burn mark around Buddy's neck, the mark of a chain that had been too tight for too long. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" John muttered, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Buddy. But he wagged his tail, leaning into John's touch. The peace of the moment was shattered by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Buddy's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "Hush!" John stood quickly, peeking through the window. A black pickup truck idled at the curb, its engine rumbling. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see the driver. The man slid into the minicube and settled back to wait. "Stay here," John said to Buddy, his voice low. He stepped outside, keeping his hand on the doorframe for support. The truck didn't move. "Can I help you?" John called out, his tone firm. The engine revved and the truck peeled away, kicking up a spray of snow and gravel. John watched it disappear down the street, unease curling in his gut, panic. When he stepped back inside, Buddy was waiting for him, his tail wagging cautiously. "Looks like we've got company," John said grimly. The next morning, John found the first sign of trouble. The back door of the store was ajar, its lock shattered. Inside, shelves were overturned, and the cash register was pried open. Buddy barked sharply, circling the wreckage. "They're sending a message," John muttered, his fists clenching. Rebecca arrived an hour later, taking in the scene with a grim expression. "This isn't just about the dog anymore," she said. "They're trying to intimidate you." "Well, it's working," John admitted, his voice tight. Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're not backing down. This is evidence, John, more proof that Carl's not just some guy looking for his dog." As Rebecca photographed the damage, Buddy sat beside John, his body pressed against his leg. It was as if the dog knew that their battle was only beginning. That night, John fortified the store as best he could. He replaced the broken lock on the back door, double-checked the windows, and even set up a makeshift alarm system using a few old cans and string. It wasn't much, but it gave him a small sense of control. Buddy watched him work, his dark eyes following every movement. Occasionally he would get up, circle the room, and sniff the doors as if patrolling for threats. "You're a better guard than I'll ever be," John muttered, tossing Buddy a treat. The dog caught it mid-air, wagging his tail. But the quiet didn't last. Around midnight, the sound of shattered glass jolted John awake. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the bed and raced toward the front of the store. Buddy was already there, barking ferociously at a figure silhouetted in the broken window. "Get out of here," John shouted, brandishing the bat. The figure hesitated, then ducked back into the shadows. But it wasn't alone. Two more shapes emerged from the darkness, circling toward the back door. John's pulse pounded in his ears. "Buddy, stay close." The dog growled low in his throat, his body tense as he positioned himself between John and the intruders. One of the men, a burly figure with a crowbar, stepped forward. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, old man," he sneered. "Just give us the dog." John tightened his grip on the bat. "You're not getting him." The man chuckled. "Your call." He swung the crowbar, but Buddy lunged, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. The intruder screamed, dropping the weapon as he tried to shake Buddy off. "Buddy, here," John commanded. The other two men hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. The burly man clutched his bleeding arm, cursing under his breath. "This isn't over," he spat, stumbling toward the door. The three of them disappeared into the night, leaving behind shattered glass and a trail of blood. Now there was only the sound of their feet and a trail of blood. The next morning, Rebecca arrived to find the store in chaos. John recounted the events of the night, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "They were after Buddy," he said. "No question about it." Rebecca frowned, jotting down notes. "This is escalating faster than I expected. We need to report this to the authorities. Again." "Do you think they'll take it seriously this time?" John asked, skepticism heavy in his tone. "They'd better," Rebecca replied. "This isn't just harassment anymore, it's criminal." Buddy sat at John's feet, his ears perked as if he were listening. Despite the chaos, his calm presence was a steadying force. "We're not going anywhere, Buddy," John said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "They'll have to go through me first." That evening, John took stock of what he had. A few tools, a loyal dog, and a lawyer who refused to back down. It didn't feel like much, but it would have to be enough. Rebecca called later with an update. "I found some old reports from animal control," she said. "They're linked to Carl, complaints about dogfighting, illegal breeding operations, the works. If we can tie Buddy to one of those cases, we might have a shot. How do we prove it? John asked. Rebecca hesitated. There's only one way. We need to find where Carl's keeping his operation. If Buddy escaped from there, he might be the key to shutting it down for good. John looked at Buddy, who was lying by the fire, his eyes half closed. What do you think, boy? You up for one more fight? Buddy's tail thumped against the floor. The morning after the attack, John sat across from Rebecca in her office, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. The room was modest but functional, with a desk piled high with files and a whiteboard covered in notes and diagrams. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, flipping through a thick folder. So, we've got harassment, breaking and entering, and assault, she said, ticking off items on her fingers. That's enough to press charges. But we still need a way to prove Carl's ownership claim over Buddy is invalid. John nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his frustration. What about the animal control reports you mentioned? Can they help? Rebecca tapped a pen against her desk. They're circumstantial at best. What we need is concrete proof, something that ties Carl to Buddy in a way that shows abuse or neglect. John glanced at Buddy, who lay curled up at his feet. The dog looked peaceful, but his ears twitched at every sound from the hallway. Is there any chance Buddy's microchipped? Rebecca asked suddenly. John frowned. I hadn't thought of that. It's worth checking, Rebecca said. If he is and it's registered to Carl, we could potentially use it against him, especially if the registration date overlaps with any of the complaints filed against Carl. Later that afternoon, John drove Buddy to the nearest veterinary clinic. The building was small but welcoming, with a cheerful receptionist who cooed over Buddy as they checked in. Such a handsome boy, she said, scratching under Buddy's chin. He's been through a lot, John replied, his voice soft. When their turn came, the vet scanned Buddy's neck with a handheld device. A soft beep confirmed the presence of a microchip. Good news, he's chipped, the vet said, pulling up the details on her computer. Her expression shifted as she read the information. This chip is registered to a Carl Dawson. John's stomach sank. Is that bad? He asked. The vet hesitated. It depends. Ownership laws vary by state, but if there's evidence of abuse or neglect, the courts typically side with the current caregiver. Do you have any documentation showing how you found him or his condition when you took him in? I've been keeping records and photos, John said. That's a good start, the vet replied. I'd also recommend filing an official report with animal control. The more evidence you have, the better your chances. When John relayed the news to Rebecca, her reaction was measured, but firm. This doesn't change our approach, she said. If anything, it gives us more reason to build a solid case. The fact that Carl microchipped Buddy proves he had legal possession at some point, but it doesn't absolve him of abuse. John exhaled slowly, his fists clenching. How do we make sure Buddy stays with me? He asked. We prove you're the better caretaker, Rebecca said. That means vet records, witness statements, anything that shows Buddy's improvement since he's been with you. And we'll need testimony about Carl's behavior. If we can tie him to the complaints from animal control, that'll be even better. John's mind raced. He thought about the scar on Buddy's neck, the burn marks, the way the dog flinched at loud noises. I'll do whatever it takes, he said, his voice resolute. Rebecca smiled faintly. Good, because Carl won't make this easy. That evening, John sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the collection of photos and notes he had gathered about Buddy. He had documented everything, Buddy's scars, his thin frame when he first arrived, and the steady transformation into a healthier, happier dog under John's care. Buddy sat at his feet, his head resting on John's knee. Occasionally, the dog would glance up, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Buddy's features were somber. We'll get through this, boy, John murmured, scratching behind Buddy's ears. I'm not letting him take you back. As he worked, a knock on the door startled both of them. Buddy was on his feet in an instant, barking sharply. John's heart raced as he grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. It was Officer Brian, a young cop from the local police department who had recently been assigned to the case. John opened the door, his relief tempered by curiosity. "Evening, John," Brian said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "Rebecca asked me to check in. She thought you might need some help documenting the evidence. I've been checking it out, and I think I can give her some good advice." "How's that?" John gestured toward the table. "Got plenty of it here." Ryan whistled softly as he scanned the photos and notes. "You've been thorough," said Kurtz. "I'm not taking any chances," John replied. Brian nodded, his expression turning serious. "Good, because Carl Dawson isn't the kind of guy who gives up easily. We've had run-ins with him before, always skirting the line of the law, but never enough to nail him." John's jaw tightened. "Well, he's crossed the line now, breaking into my store, threatening me, and trying to take Buddy? That's not something I'm letting slide." Brian smiled faintly, glad to hear it. "Rebecca's building a solid case, but it's going to come down to how well we can prove Carl's mistreatment of Buddy. I'd suggest reaching out to anyone who might have seen what he's done. Neighbors, former employees, anyone who can testify." John exhaled slowly. "I'll see what I can do." The next day, Rebecca arranged for John to meet with a woman named Karen, the director of a local animal shelter. Karen had been involved in filing several of the complaints against Carl years ago, and Rebecca believed she could provide valuable testimony. Karen greeted John warmly when he arrived, her eyes lighting up as she knelt to pet Buddy. "So this is the famous Buddy," she said, smiling. "You're a lucky dog to have found someone like John." John smiled. Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. John cleared his throat. "Rebecca said you might be able to help us. She mentioned you've dealt with Carl before?" Karen's expression darkened. "More times than I'd like to admit. He's been running shady operations for years, breeding dogs in filthy conditions, selling them to the highest bidder. I've seen the aftermath firsthand. Dogs with scars, broken bones, you name it." John felt his chest tighten. "Do you think Buddy might have come from one of those operations?" Karen studied Buddy carefully, her gaze lingering on the scar around his neck. "It's possible. The way he flinches at loud noises, the scars, he's got all the signs of a dog that's been through hell." "Yes, I guess that's true," she said. "Would you be willing to testify?" John asked. Karen nodded without hesitation. Anything to stop Carl from hurting another animal. As John and Buddy left the shelter, his phone buzzed with a call from Rebecca. "I've got some good news," she said. "One of Carl's former associates has agreed to speak with us. He's not exactly a model citizen, but he's willing to confirm that Carl was running dog fights and illegal breeding rings." John's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "When can we meet him?" "Tomorrow," Rebecca replied. "But be careful. If Carl finds out this guy's talking, things could get ugly fast." John glanced at Buddy, who was curled up in the passenger seat, his nose resting on his paws. "We'll be ready," he said. The next day, John and Rebecca met their new witness, Eddie, at a diner on the outskirts of town. Eddie was wiry and jittery, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting Carl to appear at any moment. "You sure this is safe?" Eddie muttered, his voice low. "It's as safe as it gets," Rebecca replied firmly. "If you want to help, now's the time. Otherwise, Carl's going to keep getting away with this." Eddie shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming against the table. "Yeah, all right. Look, I used to work for Carl a few years back, helping with the dog fights. I didn't like it, but..." He hesitated, avoiding John's gaze. "Let's just say Carl doesn't give people a lot of options." "What can you tell us about Buddy?" Rebecca asked, her tone professional but pressing. Eddie glanced at the scarred dog lying quietly at John's feet. That one? He was one of Carl's favorites. Not for fighting, though. Too smart for that. Carl used him to train the others, taught them to fight by chasing him around, nipping at his heels. Poor dog was too quick for most of them, but when one did catch him... Eddie trailed off, his face darkening. John's hand clenched into a fist under the table. His eyes flicked over the details of the experiment. "You have proof?" Rebecca pressed. Eddie nodded. "Yeah." Carl kept records, ledgers, videos, even photos. I don't know where he's stashing them now, but he used to keep that stuff in a warehouse near the train tracks. "Would you testify to that in court?" Rebecca asked. Eddie hesitated, his fear evident. "If it comes to that, yeah, but you better find those records first. Carl's not gonna go down easy." That evening, back at the store, John and Rebecca discussed their next move. Buddy sat between them, his ears perking up at every mention of Carl's name. "We need to find that warehouse," Rebecca said. "If Carl's hiding evidence there, it could be the smoking gun we need." "It's risky," John said, his voice heavy with concern. "If Carl catches wind of this..." Rebecca gave him a pointed look. "Do you want to protect Buddy or not?" John exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You know I do. I just don't want to walk into something we can't handle." Rebecca nodded. "That's why we'll bring in backup. I'll loop in Officer Brian. With his help, we can scout the place and figure out the best way to get what we need." Buddy nudged John's hand with his nose, as if sensing his hesitation. John looked down at the dog, his resolve hardening, and huffed out. He rose to his feet. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." 2 nights later, John, Rebecca, and Officer Brian parked a short distance from the warehouse Eddie had described. The building was dilapidated, its windows boarded up and its exterior covered in graffiti. "Looks abandoned," Brian said, peering through binoculars. "That's what Carl wants you to think," Rebecca replied. "But I guarantee he's still using it." John and Buddy exited the car, keeping low as they approached the side of the building. Buddy's nose twitched, his body alert. "He smells something," John whispered. They circled the warehouse, finding a broken window that provided a partial view of the interior. Stacks of crates and cages filled the space, some of them emitting faint whimpers and growls. "There's no mistaking it," Rebecca said softly. "This is it." Brian radioed for backup while John pulled out his phone, snapping photos of the scene. Buddy stood at his side, growling low in his throat as shadows moved inside the building. "Enfoot." "We've got company," John said, his voice tense. 3 men emerged from the far end of the warehouse, their voices carrying through the night. "What do we do?" Brian asked, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "We wait," Rebecca replied. "Let's not tip them off until the backup arrives." Buddy, however, had other ideas. With a sudden burst of energy, he bolted toward the warehouse, barking loudly. "Buddy, no!" John hissed. But it was too late. The men turned at the sound, one of them raising a flashlight. "What the hell?" Buddy darted between the stacks of crates, his agile movements drawing the men away from the main entrance. "He's buying us time," Rebecca said. "Let's move." Inside the warehouse, John and Rebecca quickly located a desk piled high with papers and a locked filing cabinet. Brian kept watch near the door, his radio crackling softly as backup units confirmed their arrival. John rifled through the papers, his heart pounding. "Ledgers, receipts, this is it. This ties Carl to everything." Rebecca broke open the filing cabinet, pulling out a stack of DVDs and photographs. "And this is the nail in the coffin," she said grimly. Buddy suddenly reappeared, panting but unharmed. His tail wagged as he trotted up to John, his eyes shining with determination. "Good boy," John said, patting Buddy's head. Just as they prepared to leave, a voice shouted from the far end of the warehouse, "Hey, what are you doing in here?" It was Carl. Carl's voice echoed through the warehouse, sharp and angry. "What the hell are you doing in my place?" he bellowed, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete floor. John froze for a split second, clutching the stack of papers in his hands. Rebecca and Officer Brian exchanged quick glances, their bodies tensed for action. Buddy growled low in his throat, his body pressed close to John's leg, ready to spring into action. "We need to move. Now," Rebecca hissed. She shoved the photographs and DVDs into her bag, zipping it closed with shaking hands. Carl's footsteps drew closer, and two of his men appeared from the shadows, their flashlights sweeping across the room. The beams of light caught the edge of Rebecca's bag. "There," one of them shouted. Buddy barked loudly, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The sound startled the men, giving John and the others a split second to react. "Run!" Brian yelled, pulling his weapon. The group bolted toward the side exit, Buddy leading the way. The door was partially blocked by a stack of crates, and John shoved them aside with all his strength. Behind them, Carl's men gave chase. The sound of their boots pounding against the concrete was deafening, mingling with their angry shouts. Brian paused at the doorway, turning back to cover their retreat. "Go! I've got this!" "No, we stick together," John shouted. But Brian held up a hand. "I'll be right behind you. Just get Buddy out of here." John hesitated for only a moment before pushing through the door. Outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap. Rebecca was already running toward their car, her bag clutched tightly against her chest. Buddy stopped at the edge of the parking lot, looking back at the warehouse and barking furiously. "Come on, Buddy," John called. The dog hesitated, his instincts pulling him toward the danger, but he obeyed John's command, racing to his side. His companion didn't ask. Inside the warehouse, Brian took cover behind a stack of crates, his weapon drawn. The two henchmen advanced cautiously, their own guns raised. "You think you can just walk in here and steal from us?" one of them snarled. Brian smirked, his voice steady. "Looks like I already did." The first man lunged forward, firing wildly, but Brian ducked and returned fire. The second man shouted a warning and retreated, but not before Brian clipped him in the leg. "You're outnumbered?" Carl's voice boomed from somewhere in the warehouse. Brian gritted his teeth. He could hear the sirens of the approaching backup units, but they were still a few minutes away. All he had to do was hold them off long enough for John and Rebecca to escape. "You sure about that, Carl?" Brian shouted back, his tone mocking. "Because it seems like your boys aren't doing too great." Carl let out an angry growl, and the sound of his heavy boots grew louder. While Officer Brian held off Carl and his men inside the warehouse, John and Rebecca ran toward the car, their breaths visible in the freezing night air. Buddy darted ahead, his sharp barks cutting through the silence. "Get in," Rebecca shouted as she unlocked the doors. John threw open the passenger door and climbed in with Buddy close behind. The dog leapt onto the seat, his head swiveling as he scanned for danger. Rebecca tossed the bag of evidence onto the back seat and slid into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. Come on," she muttered, her hands shaking. The car's engine roared to life just as a black pickup truck screeched into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. "They've got backup," John growled, gripping the dashboard. Rebecca slammed her foot on the gas, the tires spinning on the icy pavement before catching traction. The car lurched forward, narrowly avoiding the pickup as it barreled toward them. As Rebecca navigated the narrow, winding road away from the warehouse, John twisted in his seat to look back. The black pickup was gaining on them, its driver flashing the headlights and honking aggressively. "They're not letting us go," John said grimly. Buddy barked loudly, standing on the seat with his front paws on the dashboard. His sharp eyes tracked the approaching truck, and he let out a deep growl. "What's he doing?" Rebecca asked, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I think he's trying to warn us," John said. "Take the next turn. It's a shortcut back to town." Rebecca hesitated but nodded, yanking the wheel sharply to the right. The car skidded slightly on the icy road before straightening out. The pickup followed, its headlights bouncing as it hit a pothole. "They're not giving up," Rebecca muttered. Buddy let out another bark, his tail wagging furiously as he turned to John. The dog seemed to be urging him to act. "He wants us to do something," John said, scanning the area ahead. His eyes landed on a small bridge up ahead, its surface slick with ice. "Slow down when we hit the bridge." Rebecca gave him a sharp look. "What?" "Why? Just trust me," John said. As they reached the bridge, Rebecca eased off the gas, the car slowing to a crawl. The black pickup, unable to adjust its speed in time, skidded wildly as it attempted to follow. The truck fishtailed, its back end slamming into the guardrail with a deafening crash. "That's not going to stop them for long," Rebecca said, her voice tight. John nodded, already opening the car door. "Keep driving. I'll buy us some time." "Are you crazy?" Rebecca shouted. "I'm back. I've got Buddy with me. We'll be fine," John said firmly. Buddy jumped out of the car, landing lightly on the icy ground. He barked once, looking up at John as if to say, "I've got your back." "Go!" John shouted, waving Rebecca forward. Reluctantly, Rebecca hit the gas, the car disappearing down the road. The pickup truck's driver climbed out, cursing as he inspected the damage. Two other men emerged from the vehicle, their faces twisted with anger as they spotted John and Buddy standing on the bridge. "Well, look who we have here," one of them sneered, pulling a crowbar from the truck bed. Buddy growled, his body tense as he stepped forward, placing himself between John and the approaching men. "You're making a big mistake," John said, his voice cold. "No, old man," the driver replied, pulling a knife from his belt. "The mistake was thinking you could mess with Carl Dawson and get away with it." As the men advanced, Buddy sprang into action. The dog lunged at the man with the crowbar, knocking him off balance. The weapon clattered to the ground as Buddy's teeth sank into the man's arm. The driver lunged toward Buddy, but John stepped in, swinging a piece of broken guardrail like a bat. The impact sent the man stumbling back, his knife falling into the snow. "Good boy, Buddy," John shouted, dodging a punch from the third man. Buddy released his grip on the first attacker and turned his attention to the others, his sharp barks echoing across the bridge. The remaining men hesitated, clearly unnerved by the dog's ferocity. The sound of sirens in the distance made them freeze. "Cops," one of them muttered, his voice panicked. "This isn't over," the driver spat before retreating to the damaged truck. The three men climbed into the vehicle, its engine sputtering to life. The truck sped off, its tail lights disappearing into the darkness. John knelt beside Buddy, running a hand through the dog's fur. "You okay, boy?" Buddy licked John's face, his tail wagging. Despite the tension, John chuckled. "You're one tough dog." The Jeep. Moments later, Rebecca returned in the car, her face pale but determined. "Are you two all right?" she asked, stepping out and surveying the scene. "We're fine," John replied. "But they'll be back. We need to finish this. Soon." Rebecca nodded, her jaw set. "Let's get back to town and figure out our next move," Charlie said. As they drove away, Buddy curled up in the back seat, his eyes half closed but his body still alert. "We'll get through this," John murmured, glancing at the dog in the rearview mirror. "Together." But the drive back to town was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional soft whine from Buddy, who lay sprawled across the back seat. John glanced at the dog through the rearview mirror, his thoughts racing. Buddy had proven himself again, not just as a companion, but as a protector. Rebecca broke the silence. "That could have gone a lot worse," she said, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. "It's not over yet," John replied. "They'll regroup, and next time they'll be smarter. More aggressive." "We've got the evidence now," Rebecca countered. "That's what matters. We just need to make sure it gets to the right people before Carl has a chance to bury it." Buddy lifted his head, his ears twitching, as though he understood the conversation. "I don't think Carl's going to stop until he gets what he wants," John said. "And right now, that's Buddy." Back at the store, John secured the doors and windows, his movements methodical but tense. Rebecca sat at the counter, organizing the evidence they had collected at the warehouse: ledgers, photographs, and the incriminating DVDs. "This is enough to sink Carl," she said, her voice steady. "If we can get it to the authorities, he won't be able to weasel his way out this time." John nodded, though his focus was on Buddy, who was sniffing around the store, his tail wagging slightly. Despite the chaos of the evening, the dog seemed calm, almost content. "You earned a good rest, Buddy," John said, patting the dog's head. "But something tells me you're not done yet." Buddy barked softly as if in agreement. The respite didn't last long. Just before dawn, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the fragile peace. John jolted awake, grabbing the bat he kept by the bed. Buddy was already at the door, barking furiously. John peeked through the blinds and saw two cars parked outside, their engines idling. The silhouettes of several men were visible through the windows. "They're here," John muttered, pulling on his boots. Rebecca, who had been sleeping on the couch in the back room, appeared with a flashlight. "We need to call Brian. He can have units here in minutes." "No time," John said, motioning toward the men stepping out of the cars. "They're not waiting." But he growled, his body low to the ground as he stared at the intruders. The men approached the store, armed with bats and crowbars. One of them shouted, "You've got something that belongs to Carl. Hand it over and nobody gets hurt." John's grip tightened on his bat. "Not happening." The leader sneered, "Suit yourself." The first man swung his crowbar at the glass door, shattering it with a deafening crash. Buddy lunged through the broken doorway, tackling the man to the ground. His sharp teeth clamped down on the attacker's arm, eliciting a scream of pain. John stepped forward, swinging his bat at the second man, who barely managed to dodge the blow. Rebecca stayed back, frantically calling Brian for backup while trying to keep the evidence safe. Two more men rushed inside, but Buddy was relentless. He darted between them, snapping and barking, his movements quick and precise. "Get the dog!" one of them shouted, but Buddy was too fast. He lunged at the leader, knocking him into a display shelf. John used the distraction to take down another attacker, his years of training as a cop kicking in. With a well-placed swing, he disarmed the man and sent him stumbling out the door. "Enough!" the leader shouted, clutching his bleeding arm. "We'll be back, old man. This isn't over." With that, the group retreated to their cars, leaving behind shattered glass and overturned shelves. As the sound of the cars faded into the distance, John collapsed into a chair, his chest heaving. Buddy padded over to him, his tail wagging despite the tension still lingering in the air. "You're one hell of a dog," John said, scratching behind Buddy's ears. Rebecca emerged from the back room, her phone still in hand. "Brian's on his way," she said. "But we can't stay here, John. They'll just keep coming." "I'm not discrediting his strength, nor desperation for vision or bravery," Rebecca said. "But we can't stay here, John." John nodded, his mind already racing. "We'll need a new plan, and fast." Buddy barked, his eyes shining with determination. "Bravely." "We'll figure it out, boy," John said, his voice steady. "Together." The morning sun rose over a town still recovering from the chaos of the night. John stood outside his store, surveying the damage. The shattered glass door was boarded up, and the inside was in disarray, with overturned shelves and broken displays. Buddy sat by his side, his eyes scanning the street as if on high alert. Rebecca arrived shortly after, accompanied by Officer Brian. The young cop shook his head as he stepped inside. "Looks like they really meant business," he said, inspecting the damage. "They're getting desperate," John replied. "We hit a nerve when we took those ledgers and videos." Rebecca set her bag down on the counter, pulling out the evidence they had gathered. "Desperate or not, this is enough to take Carl down," she said. "But we need more, something irrefutable that ties him directly to the larger operation." Brian nodded. "The warehouse raid gave us a lot, but if Carl's still running his network, he'll have a backup location for the records. That's what we need to find." "Right." John glanced at Buddy, who was sniffing the air, his body tense. "He's been leading us right so far," John said. "Maybe he can help us again." Later that day, the group decided to follow a lead. Buddy had picked up a scent during the attack at the warehouse, and John believed it could guide them to Carl's new base of operations. Brian brought along a GPS tracker, attaching it to Buddy's collar. "If he gets ahead of us, we'll still know where he's going," Brian explained. "But we're letting him out of sight," John said firmly. They started at the outskirts of town, near an abandoned industrial park. Buddy led the way, his nose to the ground and his tail wagging slightly as he picked up the scent. The area was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the overgrown weeds. "This place gives me the creeps," Rebecca muttered, clutching her flashlight. "It's perfect for someone like Carl," John replied. "Hidden, out of the way, and no one to hear anything." But he suddenly stopped, his body stiffening as he let out a low growl. "What is it, boy?" John whispered. The dog barked once, then darted forward, leading them to a large metal gate. Beyond it was an old factory, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. "This has to be it," Brian said, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Rebecca nodded. "If Carl's here, we need to be smart about this. No rushing in without a plan." They decided to stake out the factory from a safe distance. Rebecca used a pair of binoculars to survey the area, while John and Brian kept watch with Buddy by their side. "There's movement," Rebecca said quietly. "Two guards by the main entrance, armed. Looks like they've upgraded their security," Brian muttered. "We'll need backup if we're going to get inside," John said. Rebecca lowered the binoculars, her expression grim. "We don't have time to wait. If Carl knows we've got evidence, he could destroy whatever's left in there at any moment." John glanced at Buddy, who was sitting patiently, his eyes fixed on the factory. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." As the group huddled near the edge of the industrial park, Rebecca laid out their plan. "We can't just storm the place," she said, her voice low but firm. "If we're caught, it's over. Not just for us, but for any chance of stopping Carl." Brian nodded. "We'll need to create a distraction. If we can lure the guards away, we might be able to slip inside and find whatever Carl's hiding." John frowned. "And if Carl's in there himself?" Rebecca met his gaze, her expression serious. "Then we stick to the objective. We're here for the evidence, not a fight." Buddy growled softly, his body tense as he watched the factory. John crouched beside him, scratching his ears. "You're ready for this, aren't you, boy?" Stu sat up and looked up at the partners. "Who were they then?" Buddy licked his hand in response, his tail wagging slightly. Brian took charge of creating the diversion. He set up a small device, a portable speaker rigged with loud noises near the rear of the factory. As the speaker emitted a sudden, piercing alarm, the guards at the front entrance snapped to attention. "What the hell is that?" one of them muttered, gripping his weapon as he signaled to the other to investigate. The two guards moved toward the noise, leaving the front entrance momentarily unguarded. "That's our chance," Rebecca whispered. John, Rebecca, and Buddy crept toward the factory, staying low to avoid being seen. They slipped through the main entrance, the heavy metal door groaning softly as it opened. Inside, the factory was dark and cavernous. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and rust, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. Buddy led the way, his nose to the ground as he navigated the maze of crates and machinery. John and Rebecca followed closely, their flashlights casting narrow beams of light that danced across the walls. "This place is bigger than I thought," Rebecca murmured, her voice barely audible. Buddy suddenly stopped, his ears perking up as he let out a soft bark. He pawed at a stack of crates near the far wall. "What's he found?" John asked, crouching beside the dog. Rebecca moved closer, shining her flashlight on the crates. She spotted a faint logo stamped on the wood, a symbol that matched the ledgers they had recovered earlier. "This is it," she said. "These crates are part of Carl's operation." John pried open one of the crates with a crowbar, revealing rows of sealed plastic bags. Inside were what appeared to be documents, along with a small metal lockbox. "Jackpot," Rebecca said, her eyes widening. John opened the lockbox, revealing a collection of USB drives and photographs. His stomach churned as he flipped through the images. Clear evidence of dogfighting rings, illegal transactions, and even payments to local officials. "This is what we need," John said grimly. "It's enough to bury Carl and his whole operation." As they packed up the evidence, Buddy let out a low, warning growl. John looked up just in time to see a flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "Someone's coming," he hissed. The group froze, their breath caught as footsteps echoed through the factory. "We need to move," Rebecca whispered. Buddy barked once, then darted toward the shadows, his movements quick and deliberate. The sound startled the approaching figure, who muttered a curse and turned in the opposite direction. "He's buying us time," John said, his voice tight. "Let's go." They slipped through a side door just as the guards regrouped near the crates. Buddy rejoined them moments later, his tail wagging triumphantly. John, Rebecca, and Buddy navigated the dimly lit corridors of the factory, their breaths shallow as they tried to remain silent. The evidence they carried felt heavier with every step, the weight of its significance pressing on them. Buddy paused at a corner, his ears perking up as muffled voices echoed through the halls. John crouched beside him, placing a calming hand on the dog's back. "They're searching for us," Rebecca whispered, clutching the bag tightly. "We need to find another way out," John replied, scanning the area for an exit. Buddy suddenly tugged at John's sleeve, pulling him toward a side passage. "Knows something," Rebecca said, following closely. The passage led to a set of metal stairs, descending into what appeared to be a storage basement. The air grew colder, and the walls were lined with rusted pipes that creaked under their weight. At the bottom of the stairs, they found an old service tunnel. It was narrow and damp, with faint light filtering in from a grated vent at the far end. "This might be our way out," Rebecca said, her voice filled with cautious hope. Buddy darted ahead, his tail wagging as he sniffed the ground. John and Rebecca followed, their footsteps echoing softly. Halfway through the tunnel, a sudden clang rang out behind them. John spun around, his heart racing. "They're on to us," he said grimly. "Keep moving," Rebecca urged. Buddy barked sharply, urging them forward. The group emerged from the tunnel into a fenced-off yard behind the factory. The night air hit them like a shock, but they had no time to rest. Flashlights swept across the yard as Carl's men closed in. In moments more, Match and a draft caused... "There they are," one of the guards shouted. John pushed Rebecca behind a stack of crates. "Stay low, I'll cover you." Buddy stood at John's side, growling fiercely as the men advanced. One of them raised a bat, but before he could swing, Buddy lunged. The man stumbled backward, dropping the weapon as Buddy's sharp teeth found his arm. John took advantage of the distraction, disarming another attacker with a swift swing of his flashlight. Rebecca ducked behind the crates, clutching the evidence like her life depended on it. "Buddy, come," John called, and the dog obeyed instantly, retreating to his side. More footsteps approached, but the sound of sirens in the distance made the guards hesitate. "Cops are coming," one of them shouted. "Let's go!" another yelled, pulling his wounded companion toward the factory. Moments later, patrol cars screeched into the yard, their lights casting a red and blue glow over the scene. Officer Brian was the first to step out, his weapon drawn. "Everybody down," he commanded, his voice booming. The remaining guards dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Carl, however, was nowhere to be seen. Brian approached John and Rebecca, his expression both relieved and concerned. "You two okay?" "We're fine," John replied, glancing down at Buddy, who was panting but uninjured. Rebecca held up the bag. "We got everything. This is more than enough to take Carl down." Brian nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good, because this time he's not slipping through the cracks." As the officers secured the scene and began cataloging the evidence, John knelt beside Buddy, rubbing the dog's head. "You saved us again, boy," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "But it had price." Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into John's touch. Rebecca joined them, her face serious but hopeful. "We've dealt a major blow tonight, but Carl's still out there. He won't go down without a fight." John's expression hardened. "Then we'll be ready for him." Buddy barked once, his eyes shining with determination. The days following the raid on the factory were tense. Carl had gone underground, but his presence loomed over the town like a storm cloud. John, Rebecca, and Officer Brian worked tirelessly to compile their case, using the evidence they'd collected to tie Carl to his illegal operations. Buddy stayed close to John, his watchful eyes scanning every shadow. The dog's instincts were sharper than ever, sensing the danger that seemed to creep closer with each passing day. Late one night, as John sat at his kitchen table reviewing documents, Buddy's low growl broke the silence. John glanced up, his heart skipping a beat. "What is it, boy?" he asked, following Buddy to the window. Outside, a car idled at the curb, its headlights off. John couldn't make out the driver, but his gut told him it wasn't a friendly visit. "They're watching us," John muttered, grabbing his phone. He called Rebecca, who answered on the second ring. "Carl's people are outside," he said. Rebecca's voice was steady but urgent. "We knew this was coming. Stay put and lock everything down. I'll call Brian." Minutes later, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. John grabbed a flashlight and a metal pipe, his adrenaline surging. Buddy stood at his side, growling fiercely. Two men climbed through the shattered window, their faces obscured by masks. One carried a crowbar, the other a knife. "Hand over the dog and the evidence," one of them snarled. But they were too slow. "Not a chance," John shot back, raising the pipe. The man lunged, but Buddy was faster. The dog leaped forward, his teeth sinking into the attacker's arm. The man screamed, dropping his knife. Buddy ran to the front of the crowd to his attacker, dropped the razor carefully. He was wearing a loose-leaf gun. John swung the pipe at the second intruder, knocking him off balance. The man stumbled into a table, sending papers flying. Buddy released the first attacker, who scrambled toward the window, clutching his arm. "This isn't over!" the man shouted as he climbed back outside. The second man followed, leaving behind a trail of blood and chaos. Rebecca and Brian arrived moments later, their faces grim as they surveyed the damage. "This was a message," Brian said, examining the shattered window. "Carl knows we're closing in and he's getting desperate." John nodded, his jaw tight. "If he thinks he can scare us, he's wrong." Rebecca placed a hand on John's shoulder. "We're close, John, but we need to end this, once and for all." Buddy barked in agreement, his tail wagging as if to say he was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, John, Rebecca, and Officer Brian gathered at the police station to formulate their plan. The evidence they had collected was damning, but they needed Carl himself to ensure a conviction. "We've got one shot at this," Rebecca said, spreading a map of the town across the table. She pointed to a remote area on the outskirts. "Carl's been spotted here, a private airstrip he's likely using for his smuggling operations." Brian nodded. "If he's running, it'll be through that airstrip. We need to intercept him before he disappears." John leaned over the map, his finger tracing the surrounding terrain. "It's isolated, with only one road in and out. Perfect for an ambush." "Exactly," Rebecca said, "but it also means he'll have backup. We'll need to move fast and hit hard." Buddy sat beside John, his ears perking up at the mention of Carl's name. John looked down at the dog, his expression resolute. "You're coming with me, Buddy. We'll finish this together." As night fell, the group made their way toward the airstrip. Backup units from the local police department were stationed along the road, ready to close in when the time came. John, Rebecca, and Brian approached the airstrip on foot, using the cover of darkness to stay hidden. Buddy moved silently at John's side, his body low to the ground and his nose twitching as he picked up Carl's scent. The airstrip was illuminated by a few dim lights, revealing a small plane parked near a hangar. Several armed men milled around, their voices carrying through the still night air. "There he is," Rebecca whispered, nodding toward a figure near the plane. Carl stood with his arms crossed, barking orders at his men. John's grip tightened on the flashlight in his hand. "Let's move." The group split up to cover more ground. Brian signaled to the backup units, who began closing in from the perimeter. John and Buddy approached the hangar, using the shadows to stay concealed. As they neared the entrance, one of Carl's guards spotted them. "Hey, who's there?" the man shouted, raising his weapon. Buddy sprang into action, leaping at the guard before he could fire. The man stumbled backward, his weapon clattering to the ground as Buddy's teeth found their mark. "Fuck off!" John seized the opportunity, disarming the guard and knocking him unconscious with a swift blow. "We're in," John whispered into his radio. Inside the hangar, Carl's men scrambled as the police units advanced. Carl, realizing the trap, bolted toward the plane, shouting for the pilot to start the engine. As always, he insisted that the pilot controlled and steered the plane and not set off the... "He's trying to escape," Rebecca called out over the radio. John and Buddy sprinted toward the plane, their determination unwavering. "We're not letting him get away," John muttered. Buddy barked in agreement, his paws pounding against the tarmac as they closed the distance. The roar of the plane's engine grew louder as Carl climbed aboard, barking orders at the panicked pilot. His men scattered under the pressure of the advancing police units, some throwing down their weapons and surrendering, while others fled into the darkness. "Don't let him take off," Brian shouted through the radio as he and Rebecca moved toward the runway. John and Buddy sprinted after the plane. The hangar lights cast long shadows across the tarmac, but their focus was locked on Carl. The dog's muscles rippled with every stride, his barks sharp and insistent as they closed the distance. Carl leaned out of the plane's open door, aiming a pistol at John and Buddy. "Back off," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. John dove behind a stack of crates, pulling Buddy down with him just as a shot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off the metal crates, the sound echoing across the airstrip. "That's the best you've got?" John muttered under his breath, peeking around the corner. Carl's pistol clicked empty, and he cursed loudly, retreating into the plane. But Buddy saw his chance. The dog darted out from behind the crates, his speed and agility unmatched as he charged toward the aircraft. "Buddy, no!" John called, but it was too late. Buddy leaped onto the plane's retracting stairs, his paws gripping the edge as he clawed his way up. Carl turned, startled, as the dog lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand. Carl stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock as Buddy snarled, his teeth bared. "Get off me, you mangy mutt!" Carl yelled, kicking wildly. But Buddy held his ground, blocking Carl's path to the cockpit. Meanwhile, John and Rebecca regrouped near the plane. Brian arrived moments later, his weapon drawn. "He's trapped," Rebecca said, gesturing to the aircraft. We just need to flush him out." Decker nodded. John nodded, his eyes fixed on Buddy, who was still holding Carl at bay inside the plane. "I'm going in," John said, determination hardening his features. Ryan placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've got units covering every exit. He's not going anywhere." "Buddy's in there," John replied, "and I'm not leaving him alone." Ryan hesitated but stepped aside, allowing John to climb the stairs leading into the plane. Inside the cabin, Carl had backed himself into a corner, his face pale as he stared at Buddy. "You think you've won, huh?" Carl sneered. "This isn't over. I've got connections, more than you can imagine." John appeared in the doorway, his voice cold and steady. "It's over, Carl. You're done." Carl lunged toward the cockpit, but Buddy intercepted him, snarling as he snapped at Carl's outstretched hand. The man froze, his bravado crumbling under the dog's unrelenting gaze. "Call him off," Carl shouted, his voice trembling. John stepped closer, crossing his arms. "Surrender now, or he won't stop." Carl hesitated for a moment before dropping to his knees, raising his hands in defeat. Moments later, Brian and Rebecca entered the plane, securing Carl in handcuffs. Outside, the sound of sirens and shouting filled the air as officers rounded up the remaining men. John knelt beside Buddy, scratching behind his ears. "You did it, boy. You stopped him." Buddy wagged his tail, licking John's face as if to say, "We did it together." With Carl in custody, the airstrip buzzed with activity. Police units secured the area, cataloging evidence from the hangar and the plane. The crates filled with documents and contraband were loaded into patrol cars, each piece adding weight to the case against Carl. Rebecca stood near one of the patrol cars, her phone pressed to her ear. She was coordinating with the district attorney's office, ensuring that every shred of evidence would hold up in court. John leaned against the side of the plane, watching as Buddy sniffed around the area, his tail wagging. Despite the tension of the night, the dog seemed calm, almost triumphant. "You're a hero tonight, boy," John said, his voice soft. Buddy barked once, as if acknowledging the compliment. Brian approached, his face a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "We got him," he said. "Carl's entire operation, done. It's going to take weeks to sort through all this evidence, but there's no way he's getting out of this." John nodded. "Good. It's about time." Batusha's. As Carl was escorted into a police car, he turned his head, his glare fixed on John. "You think this ends with me?" he snarled. "You have no idea what you've started. There are bigger players out there, ones you can't touch." John met Carl's gaze without flinching. "Maybe, but you won't be around to see it." Carl smirked, his confidence unnerving. "We'll see, old man." The door slammed shut, cutting off whatever else Carl might have said. The car drove off, its red and blue lights fading into the night. End of Chapter 1. With the operation wrapped up, John, Rebecca, and Brian returned to the airstrip's edge, where the quiet of the night began to settle over them. Rebecca exhaled deeply, crossing her arms. "We did it. This time, it's over." He looked at the purple canvas and the screaming orcas and wondered, "Can we play the same? What have I done?" Alice smiled, peering at him and asking a question. "Thanks to Buddy," Brian added, crouching to pet the dog. "He's one hell of a partner." John smiled faintly, his hand resting on Buddy's head. "He's more than that. He's family." Buddy leaned into John's touch, his tail wagging gently. The next morning, the town was abuzz with news of Carl's capture. Local papers hailed the raid as a major victory against organized crime, with headlines highlighting Buddy's role in stopping the operation. John sat on the porch of his store, a cup of coffee in hand and Buddy lying at his feet. Rebecca joined him, holding a folder filled with case updates. "So, what now?" Rebecca asked, sitting beside him. John shrugged. "We keep moving forward. Buddy and I will figure it out." Rebecca smiled. "You know, the town could use someone like you, someone who stands up for what's right." John chuckled. "We'll see." Buddy barked softly, his eyes scanning the horizon as if ready for the next challenge. As the sun set that evening, John watched Buddy play in the yard, his heart lighter than it had been in years. But a lingering thought nagged at him. Carl's final words. There were bigger players out there, and John knew this wasn't the end. But for now, he allowed himself to enjoy the peace, trusting that when the time came, he and Buddy would be ready to face whatever lay ahead. The days following Carl's arrest brought a wave of relief to the town. The warehouse and airstrip operations were dismantled, and the evidence collected during the raid tied Carl and his network to a series of crimes spanning years. For once, it seemed like justice had prevailed. John returned to his store, finding comfort in the routine of stocking shelves and greeting customers. The shattered windows had been replaced, the damage repaired, but his life felt fundamentally different now. Buddy had become a local hero, and people from all over the town stopped by just to meet him. "He's a special dog," an elderly customer said one morning, leaning down to pet Buddy. "He's more than special," John replied with a smile. "He's a lifesaver." A week later, the mayor organized a small ceremony in the town square to honor those who had helped bring Carl to justice. John stood beside Rebecca and Officer Brian, with Buddy sitting proudly at his feet. The mayor cleared his throat as he addressed the crowd. "Thanks to the bravery of our police force, the dedication of Rebecca Turner, and the courage of John Miller and his incredible dog, Buddy, our town is safer today than it has been in years." The crowd erupted into applause, and Buddy barked happily, wagging his tail as if he understood the praise. The mayor continued, "In recognition of Buddy's actions, we are proud to present him with the town's first ever honorary service dog medal." A small medal was placed around Buddy's neck, and the dog barked again, earning cheers from the crowd. John knelt beside him, his voice low but full of emotion. "You've earned it, boy. Every bit of it." With Carl behind bars and the town regaining its sense of security, John began to consider what his next steps would be. The events of the past weeks had reignited something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch with Rebecca, they talked about the future. "You know," Rebecca began, "there's a lot more we could do for dogs like Buddy. The ones who don't get a second chance." Oliver put a finger to his lips. John tilted his head, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" Rebecca smiled. "A rescue center. A place where we can help dogs who've been abused or abandoned. You've got the space here, and Buddy could be the perfect ambassador." At that moment, Rebecca was young and responsive. John looked down at Buddy, who was lounging at his feet, his eyes half closed in the warm sunlight. "You think we could pull it off?" "With your determination and Buddy's charm, absolutely," Rebecca said confidently. Over the next few months, John transformed an old barn on his property into a rescue center. With help from Rebecca, Brian, and volunteers from the community, they built kennels, a training area, and a small clinic for veterinary care. They named it Buddy's Haven in honor of the dog who had inspired it all. Dogs. The center quickly became a beacon of hope for animals in need. Buddy took on his new role with enthusiasm, greeting every new arrival with a wagging tail and showing them the ropes. One day, as John watched Buddy play with a group of rescued puppies, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "You've come a long way, boy," he said quietly, "and you've brought me along with you." As the months passed, Buddy's Haven thrived, and the town embraced its new role as a haven for animals. But John couldn't shake Carl's final words. "There are bigger players out there, ones you can't touch." Rebecca shared his unease. Carl's operation was part of something larger, we've only scratched the surface." John nodded, his expression serious. "If it comes our way, we'll handle it, like we always do." Buddy barked, his tail wagging as if to say he was ready for whatever came next. Buddy's story spread far beyond the town. News outlets picked up the tale of the brave dog who helped bring down a crime ring, and donations poured in to support Buddy's haven. John received letters from people across the country, sharing stories of their own rescues and thanking him for inspiring them. One evening, as John sat reading through the letters, he glanced at Buddy, who was curled up by the fire. "You've done more than you know, boy," he said softly. Buddy lifted his head, his eyes meeting John's with a look of quiet understanding. The sun set over the town, casting a warm glow over Buddy's haven. John stood at the edge of the property, watching Buddy play with a group of children who had come to visit the center. Their laughter mixed with Buddy's happy barks, filling the air with a sense of peace. For the first time in years, John felt truly at home. As he turned to head inside, Buddy trotted up beside him, his metal glinting in the fading light. Together, they walked into the house, ready for whatever the future might bring.